And that leads to our discussion on what variables are. So variables, as the term itself implies, right, refers to the feature that um, will change in different time periods and a different context. But in general, when we talk about variable, we're essentially saying that some aspects about this concept will change, right? So variables, like I said just now, are based on concepts and constructs. But now we're saying that this concept or this construct is not referring to something that's constant, something that's not changing. Rather, certain aspects of this concept, certain aspects or certain feature of this construct will change. And this change we call variable. So height, for example, is a concept. And we use height quite intuitively to describe a person's feature, right? And this feature, as we imagine, will change as you grow older, right? As grow older from a toddler to a young adult, you'll become taller and taller. But as you transit from adulthood to become a senior citizen, so to speak, you'll become shorter and shorter. In other words, height is not a constant. Rather, it changes across time and, more specifically, it describes a feature of a person that varies across time. Vary is just another word for change, right? So we can use all these terms to describe that change. We'll say that a person is tall, or another person is shorter, a third person is very short, is even shorter, or we can use numbers, right? 6 feet 10, 5 feet 7, 6 feet to describe the change of height. So when we provide specific descriptions to the change, a person's tall, short, very short, person 6 feet 10, a person is 5 feet 7, person 6 feet. Whenever we're describing these terms, these concrete descriptions of the change of a feature of a concept, we're talking about the values of a concept, right? So the value here does not necessarily mean a numerical value. A value can be a word, a verbal description of the feature, right? So tall is one value, 5 feet 7 is another value, very short is also a value, just the same as 6 feet is a value of height. In other words, height, this concept is variable here, can have a lot of possible values. Right, so as you said, values is not equal to numerals, right? Um, Rather, it really refers to anything, right? It can be words, it can be terms, it can be phrases, it can be numbers, it can be any other means you can think of that describes uh, the temporary state of an entity, right? So after all this discussion, then we can define variable as follows, right? So again, variable is just another type of concept, but this time we're very specific in saying that it's a concept that can take different values in different contexts across different time periods. Okay, so as you see, we add another feature to concept and we have another term here. So a concept, if it's used for scientific purpose, we call it a construct. and a construct or a concept that will change, we'll call it a variable. So let's see whether or not you understand. Brief exercise. In following, I give you certain concepts, right? And then your job is to decide whether these concepts are variables or constants. Let's start with the mathematical symbol of pi. Is pi a pi is a concept for mathematicians, but is pi a constant or a variable, right? So high school or junior high school math would tell us pi is a constant. It always equals to 3.141529 something, right? It never changes. It never changes. Whether you teach science, you teach math in America, or teach math in Japan or in Brazil, pi will always be that number. So it never changes, and that makes pi a concept that is not a variable or a constant. Hours of day. This might not be a perfect example because some people say, well, depending on the type of clock that you use, you might have different answers. But let's say, we just use an average clock, here and there, the kind of clock that we have on our phone, for example. Then you might say that, indeed, the hours of day, no matter where you go, will always be 24, right? There's not a country where there are 25 hours a day. So again, hours of day is a constant. How about days of year? Is days of year a variable or a constant? Well, the answer is the days of year is a variable, right? Because we do have leap years. Some years have 365 days, whereas some years will have 366 days, for example, right? So in other words, depending on the year itself, the days of year will also change. So days of year is a variable. Well, let's make a mark. So this is a constant. This is a constant, and this is a variable. Okay. How about the number of the states in the United States across history? Is this number a constant or a variable? Well, if you know American history pretty well, you will say that of course it's a variable because the United States, when it was founded, it only has, I don't know, maybe 13 some states. Sorry, I'm not even American. I don't know the exact history of this country, but I do know that it didn't have that many states as this country does nowadays. So across history, across time, this country has more and more states. So the number of U.S. states across history is a variable. All right. So let's So, as these examples illustrate, right? Some concept, will always be constant, whereas some will always be a variable, right? Like this, days of year. It's almost always a variable, alternating between leap years and normal years, right? And but whether or not a concept is variable or constant, for some other concepts, sometimes depend on how we ask the question, right? So if we ask the question, well, if you ask us, whether the number of U.S. states across history is a variable, then it is. because we're talking about the change of the number of US states across time. But then if we ask ourselves the same question, but take out this across history, so that we ask ourselves, well, is the number of US states a constant or a variable? Then you might say, well, it is actually constant, because nowadays, however you count, you have 50 some states in this country, right? So in this sense, the number of US states will be a constant. But then if we add these two terms, these two words to this question, then this concept will suddenly become a variable. So that's what we mean by, whether a concept is constant or variable depends on how we ask the question, right? Okay, so in the previous exercise, um, I gave you the concept, and you provide answer by saying whether that concept is a variable or not, and by specifying the values of that variable. So in this exercise, we'll do it the other way around. So in this exercise, I give you the values that some variables can take. Oh, okay. So I'm jumping ahead. So previously, we were identifying whether a concept is a constant or variable. But here I'll give you variables. There will be no constants, and your job is to tell us, or tell yourself, what are some values that these variables can take. Okay. So let's say gender. Gender is definitely a variable because it describes people who who have different beliefs about themselves, right? So the question is, well, what are the values for this variable gender? Well, very easy, right? At least, traditionally speaking, we have men and women as the two values for this variable gender. Well, nowadays you might add more, but predominantly we have these two values for the variable gender. Okay, socioeconomic class. That's another commonly seen variable in sociological studies and even in some communication studies. So this is a variable, but what are some of the values that this variable can take? Now think about it, and then the answers, well, my answers will be, they're upper class individuals or middle class people and lower class people, right? So upper, middle, lower are in this case the three values that this variable can take. Well, of course, you can have, you know, other ways of describing socioeconomic class. You can have, upper middle, lower middle. In other words, adding two more classes to the values. That's also fine, right? Depending on how you see this variable. But the bottom line is this variable will have different values. That's one value, a second value, a third value. What about happiness? What are some values that this variable can take? Oh, again, there are many ways to assign values to this variable. We can say, a person is very unhappy to slightly unhappy to a little bit unhappy to neutral and then to slightly happy, a little bit happy, and very happy, right? So this continuum from very unhappy to very happy will contain all the values for this variable happiness. Okay, so see here, for these three variables, we don't have any numbers attached to them. They're all words. But still, as we just said, right? So these words are just as values, as numerals to a variable, right? They describe the different state of a concept that we say will change. Okay, so in the previous exercise, I gave you the variable, and then you told me the values that the variables would take. Then in this exercise, we'll do it the other way around. In the following, I'll give you the values of variable, and your job is to think, well, what is the variable that these values describe? So, if I say the values for this particular variable are iPhone, Samsung, Windows Phone, right? Then what is this variable that these values describe? This variable will be, as you might guess, types of phones, right? Uh, types of phones. Phones. Or your preference of phones, right? Either way, right? So this is something that will change. That describes your preference, that describes your usage of the phones, etc., right? And this is not a constant because different people use different type of phones. Sociology, communicology, psychology. If these three terms are the values of variable, then what is that variable? What that variable could be? The answer is major, right? Major is a concept, and this concept is not a constant because in almost all universities in the world we have many majors, at least more than one major, right? We have sociology, communicology, psychology, uh, biology, physics, chemistry, etc., right? So a person's major will change, and that makes this concept variable, and these are the values that this variable can take. One more example. Pray once a year, pray once a month, pray once a week, pray every day. So if these are the values of a variable, what that variable will be? Well, very easy, right? This variable we can say it's religiosity, right? So this is a variable. Well, first of all, it's a concept. It refers to um, the strength of belief that a person has in religion, right? But then people or individuals, they differ in their strength of belief, manifested in how often they take part in these, activities. So these terms would then describe as values, right? How strongly a person believes in a certain religion. So these are values. These are values, and this is a variable. Okay, so now we understand the relationship between values and variables, right? We can return to this hypothesis that we call the formidability hypothesis. And if we recall, the hypothesis states that a more powerful person would be more prone to anger or be more aggressive. So to test this hypothesis, of course, first of all, we would define the key constructs, right? Power, as we said before, is the ability to inflict cost, um, and to sort of turn this construct into a variable, right? In other words, to describe the different values of a person they can take for this variable, we can think of power as, something as concrete as the person's physical strength. So we can measure a person's physical strength on this continuum ranging from very weak to very strong, right? We have a continuum that contains different values. As such, each person can take on a slightly different value for their power. At the same time, we can, define aggressiveness as a person's tendency to attack. So we can easily sort of assign a value of this variable, aggressiveness, to a person by asking the person, well, how easy do you get angry? Again, we can imagine a scale, right? Ranging from not easy at all to get angry to very easy. Right? So again, this continuum contains all the possible values. For example, this one will be, well, neither very easy or not very easy, right? I'm just a very calm person. I don't get emotion at all, right? So a person might score here, a second person might score here, a third person might score here, right? As such, we can have a value for each individual. The same goes for the scale for physical strength, right? A person might score here, a person might score here, a person might score here. So once we have the different values of this variable for each individual, we can immediately see whether or not there's a match, right? If the hypothesis is correct that more powerful person is more aggressive, then we should expect that a person who scores higher on this scale will also score higher on this scale, right? So for example, if these two scores, they belong to the same person, let's say, belongs to Andrew. Say Andrew answered these two questions and he scored here on this question and he scored here on this question. That means Andrew, who is very strong, also believes himself to be very prone to anger. Right? That will be consistent with this hypothesis. If instead, let's say, let's change color. Zach, when he answered these two questions, he answered the first question here. He's very weak, physically speaking, but he answered the second question by scoring here, indicating that he's actually very prone to anger, getting angry very easily. That would indicate this hypothesis is not true, at least in the case of Zach, right? Because Zach's score indicates the opposite. Zach's response to these questions indicate that a person that's very weak will be very aggressive, whereas Andrew's response will indicate that a person is very strong, will get angry very easily. So that's actually the logic of hypothesis testing. And I hope that this example will give you a first idea why it's important to turn concepts. Right? These are concepts. Why it's important to turn concepts into variables. It is because only by turning concepts into variables can we start to make sense, so to speak, of the hypothesis by looking at whether individual scores, scores by Andrew, scores by Zach, agree with the hypothesis. Okay? Right? So we can use Zach's score and Andrew's score to verify whether or not stronger men are more prone to anger. Okay, so let's stop here for the second class. So in this class, we talked about what concepts are. Concepts is a general term that describes the commonalities across, well, commonalities of a certain phenomenon. And then we introduce what constructs are. Constructs are essentially a type of concepts. This is the type of concepts that are invented specifically for scientific purposes. Lastly, we talk about variables. Variables is yet another type of concept or a type of construct, only this time variables are concepts or constructs that can take on different values, right? So these are different values. Strong, weak are the two values for physical strength. Not prone to anger and prone to anger are two values for anger, right? And then we talk about briefly the importance or what we mean by turning constructs or concepts into variables, and how by looking at the different values to a variable can help us verify hypotheses like stronger men are more prone to anger. Okay, so next class we will continue this topic on variables and start to talk about how we can plot, how we can visualize the relationships between two or more than two variables. All right, see you next class.